Okay, I'm Nina McLemore, and I want to welcome our in-person guest and our live stream guest. This is the first time we're doing that, so we're hoping all the technology is working well. We've been doing these interviews in our stores with our clients who are authors and who we think, of course, are very interesting. And we had Susan Page here about a year and a half ago doing an interview on her book on Barbara Bush called The Matriarch. We've had Kathy Sullivan, who was the first woman to walk in space and was on the launch of the Hubble. We've had Valerie Jarrett with her book. Rita McGrath, who is a professor at Columbia, who is an expert on business strategy and innovation, and her book, Seeing Around Corners. And Elaine Weiss on the Woman's Hour, whom we're going to go back to because the passage of the 19th Amendment was really interesting. Coming up, we have, on June the 5th, we have Lynn Olson. And I must say, her book, Madame Foucault's Secret War, about the woman who ran the largest spy network in France, in occupied France during the Second World War, got me through a lot of the early days of COVID, because I kept thinking, this is nothing compared to what this woman went through. Then on June the 19th, we have Karen Tumulty and her book on Nancy Reagan. And strong women, of course, you get the theme. You know, it's strong women, authors, strong women. And then June 22nd, we have Karen Gray Houston, whose father and uncle were the main lawyers for the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. So we're happy to have Susan as our inaugural speaker on Nancy Pelosi, who is clearly the most powerful woman in Congress, and with Janet Yellen, probably the most powerful woman in our government today. And I think it's a book that everybody should read, because I think it is a great book on leadership for a business person. It's a great book on how the government actually works, what it takes to get a bill passed, and some people's devotion to the people of this country. So I can't wait for us to hear more. And then Susan Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of National Geographic, which is, when I was growing up, if I had known that job existed, it would be what I wanted to do. So, and it's all about the planet and the living organisms and the beauty of our planet. So go for it.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to go back in time before we move back up into the present day. And so, Nancy Pelosi grows up in Baltimore, right? She's the daughter of the mayor and a really formidable mother, who's sort of a behind-the-scenes political force. She's got 5 older brothers, which is unbelievable. And she finally convinces her family to let her go out of town for college. And she's the first person in her family really to leave Baltimore. So it's 1958, and she goes to Trinity College, the Catholic college for women right here in Washington. And Susan, you wrote, the drive to Trinity only took about an hour, but it changed everything. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, think of this. Nancy Pelosi, as you say, she was the 7th child, born to Tommy the Elder D'Alessandro and Big Nancy Alessandro. The only girl, the youngest one, the only girl. You can imagine what a treasure she was considered, a potential nun in her mother's view. When her mother suggested this to Nancy when she was little, she replied that she didn't think she wanted to be a nun. Being a priest sounded more appealing. We can see that.
Clue.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's named after her mother, and her mother is instantly known from then on as Big Nancy, and Nancy Pelosi is known as Little Nancy. And she will be known as Little Nancy until she escapes that orbit of Baltimore. She was the only member of her family, of her immediate family, to live any place but Baltimore. It was an extraordinary escape, in a way, for her. It prompted a huge battle between her mother and father that she would go all the way to Washington instead of staying in Baltimore for college. They had one titanic battle in their kitchen, and there was an aide to Mayor D'Alessandro there who overheard it and told others, so it's become part of Pelosi lore, where her father says she'll go to Washington for college over my dead body, and Big Nancy D'Alessandro replies, "That can be arranged." So it was with the advocacy of her mother that she manages to take this trip to Washington. She's no longer known as Little Nancy. She's known as Nancy. She makes a big effort not to let her classmates know that her father is this bigger-than-life political figure. Now, some of her classmates at Trinity who I interviewed said that, of course, within minutes they all knew exactly who her father was, but that they never talked about it because it was so clear that she did not want to talk about it. She wanted to be her own person at last. She graduates from Trinity. She decides she wants to go to law school. She takes the LSATs, but first she gets engaged. She ends up getting married, not going to law school, which was the same thing that happened to her mother, interestingly. They moved first to New York and then to San Francisco. And by the time she comes back to Washington, no one thinks of her as Nancy D'Alessandro, right? There are people who I interviewed who knew her as a San Francisco Paul and Speaker of the House, who weren't aware that she had this incredible family history in Baltimore. But the only reason that's the case, the only reason she escaped that orbit, was because she took that drive to go to Trinity College. Her brother was supposed to drive her. His car broke down, so her brother's friend drove her instead to that first day at college, and his name was Peter Angelos, who is a rather familiar figure locally. And
He owned the Baltimore baseball team.
yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, she had all the right friends in the right places, clearly. But so, all right, you mentioned, so she goes to college. She meets Paul Pelosi in 1961 when he's a student here at Georgetown University. They get married 2 years later, move to New York, then to San Francisco. And incredibly, they have 4 daughters and a son in the span of 6 years and 1 week, which is nearly a biological miracle, I think it's fair to say. So after she becomes the most powerful woman in the history of the country, she said actually that her children were even more influential in shaping the political leader she became, even more so than her parents. So what do you think she really meant?
I think she meant it. And it's like at odds with kind of the common perception that all these children were this delay in getting on the path that she was born to take as a leading American political figure. She doesn't see it that way. She says that the skills that you need to run a household with 5 children are exactly the skills that you need. Tom Downey, a former member of Congress, is laughing. That the skills you need to raise 5 children in a house, exactly the same skills you need to be Speaker of the House. So think about it. Everything is always chaotic. You're always trying to impose order on chaos. Everybody's got a grievance, real or imagined. You have to deal with those. There's shifting alliances all the time in a big family like that. And you also learn you figure out how to motivate your kids or your members of Congress to do what you want them to do, ideally convincing them it was their idea in the first place. And this is a case that Pelosi has made as she recruits women to run for political office. A lot of times politicians who have identified some local woman who they think would be good for the city council or as a member of Congress will say, "Oh, I'm not qualified. Somebody else is qualified. That man over there is more qualified than I am, or I'm just a homemaker." And Pelosi will make this case over and over again, that there are ways in which is the best possible training. It does underscore how rapid her rise was in Congress. So, Steny Hoyer, the congressman from Maryland, who in some ways was a great rival of hers for the leadership, I think he was in his 5th term in Congress by the time she arrived here. So that shows you how well she did once she arrived.
Well, and I did want to ask you about that because, so she's elected in 1987, finally. She's middle-aged. She's got, I think, a high school senior, and the other kids are a little older. So she raises all these kids, and she has all these important roles in the Democratic Party up to there, raising all this money, but it's all behind the scenes, kind of like what her mom did. And meanwhile, everybody from Mario Cuomo to George Mitchell starts urging her to run for some office, right? Go be a mayor, go be a governor, go run for Congress. But she keeps saying no, no, no. Well, so what finally changed her mind?
You know, this is such a classic story. It was only when another woman told her, you should do this and you can do this, that she did it. She had been, as you say, very active in politics. She had run to be Democratic National Chair, the only race she ever lost. But she always thought of herself as her mother, as the person behind the scenes. Then Sala Burton, who was a congresswoman from California, the widow of Phil Burton, who had a legendary political machine in Northern California. Sala Burton succeeded her husband after he died in Congress in the San Francisco congressional seat, and then she is dying of cancer. And she's near death. She calls in Nancy Pelosi, whom she knows from local politics, and says, I want you to run for this seat, and if you do, I'll endorse you, which is a huge gift for the incumbent to endorse her, because they both knew it would be one of those San Francisco political races, which is to say crazy. So it's only at that point that she thinks, yes, I can and should do this. And I think you see that repeated with women in all kinds of roles. And it kind of underscores the importance of having role models in jobs so that women who are younger or girls can think, oh, that is a potential for me. I never thought it was. She runs for, when Sala Burton dies, she runs in a special election. There's a 14-person primary in which she doesn't start out as the favored candidate. There are several members of the Board of Supervisors who are running for that seat too. Harry Britt is one of them. He is favored to win the seat. She wins the seat narrowly, and by the way, thanks to Republican votes, and she has never lost an election since.
Which is really pretty amazing, although that's a really safe seat.
Once you're elected, you're safe.
Right,
yeah.
Yeah. I think since the 40s, it's been I think.
Right. But if you think of elections of all sorts, including bids for leadership positions, she's never again failed to count the votes and deliver her votes and win whatever it is she was seeking.
So it's 1987. She gets elected in this special election, and she comes into a Congress that's not that recognizable to us right now. I was looking. So Congress, the 100th Congress, has 25 women in the whole thing, right? 2 in the Senate and 23 in the House. So by contrast, now there's, 140-some women in Congress. And no woman then had ever reached the top ranks of congressional leadership. So to your point, though, she moves really fast.
Yeah.
So how did she do that?
You know, this is, there was a Tuesday night dinner group of young liberal members of Congress who would get together, sometimes at Tom Downey's house, and meet. And George Miller was a member of Congress from California who had been part of this group. So he brings Pelosi to one of these dinners. Barbara Boxer had also invited her to come to this. And George, when I interviewed Chuck Schumer, now the Senate Majority Leader for this book, he was also a member of this group. He was then in the House. He says that when George Miller introduced him to Nancy Pelosi the first time, he said, she'll be Speaker one day. Now, I'm not 100% sure this story is true because it's kind of convenient, but still, it goes to some point that she was identified early on as a potential leader and as a really serious person. And then she applied. The title of the book is The Lessons of Power. Then she applies the number one lesson of power she learned from her father, which is this: nobody is going to give you power. You have to take it. And she looked at the leadership of the Democratic Party in the House, all male, pretty established. Steny Hoyer was next in line, he thought, to be elected Democratic whip. She didn't wait for them to give her power. She decided to seize it. She waged a 3-year campaign for Democratic whip, a job most Americans couldn't describe. Before the seat is even open, and she wins it. She takes it away, and that put her within a few years to be leader of House Democrats, and a few years after that to be Speaker of the House.
It's just so amazing. And, I think this gets to one of the points you make in the book, which is there's really 2 sides to Nancy Pelosi's political self, right? She's, progressive and the pragmatist. She's a San Francisco liberal, but she's a Baltimore girl, right? And grew up in a political family.
Yeah. She's so comfortable with power. And that was why I put power in the title. I actually went through a series of titles for the book. When I signed the contract, the title was supposed to be Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Arc of Power, because she had come in and out of power. And then my agent didn't like that. We made it Nancy Pelosi and the Tests of Power. And I didn't think that was quite right. And we finally made it Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power, because she so reflects the lessons of power that she learned before she took that trip to Trinity College. The skills that she has are the lessons she learned both from her amazing father, Tommy D'Alessandro, Tommy the Elder, who had been 5 terms in Congress, 3 terms as mayor of Baltimore, and from Big Nancy as well.
So, let's look at this book cover, and I think it's such an interesting photograph of her. Why did you decide to select this photograph? And, we've all seen a million pictures of Nancy Pelosi. I've never seen one where she looks quite like this.
So I love this picture, and I hesitated to use it for a while because it's black and white. And I finally decided I liked the picture so much we would use it even though it was in black and white. And what I liked about it was the look on her, the expression on her face, which is, don't mess with me. That's one message. But it's also got it's got some history in her face, right? She looks like somebody who has experienced things. And it also has a little humor in it. And I sort of thought that combination was exactly right. There's a reporter, John Bresnahan, who is now with Punchbowl News, used to be with Politico. He did a profile of Pelosi 11 years ago in which he said that she was an iron fist in a Gucci glove. An iron fist in a Gucci glove. And that is exactly right, because she can have a Gucci glove. She can figure out what a member of Congress is really saying, what he or she really needs, how she can convince this person to vote the way she wants them to. But if she needs to, she can pull out an iron fist.
Well, you uncovered some really amazing, never before seen documents, and one of them were the pages. You uncovered some amazing documents in your research for the book, and you found some pages of a book that never got written, and this was a book that was going to be written by John Murtha, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania, part of the old guard, I think kind of came from coal country. And about her, he wrote that she was fair and tough, able to get something done, lets other people to take the credit, and able to maintain cordial relations with foes. Mm-hmm. So how did she, win over this old guard?
So, I could just talk. Okay. So you asked me in the first question of how I got her to be more forthcoming in interviews, and it relates to what you're just asking about. So Jack Murtha was a big ally of hers and very crucial in her winning the support of the old guard, the crusty old men who were not from California and didn't think much about electing a woman to the leadership. Jack Murtha was a very important figure for that. And when she announced that Murtha was going to lead her leadership fight against Steny Hoyer, this was a big surprise to Steny Hoyer, who thought that Murtha would be with him. And the person who ran his campaign told me that Hoyer was quite dismayed when that announcement was made. One of my strategies in doing interviews with Pelosi was I would, after that difficult first interview, I would try to bring something to the interview that she didn't know. So, and this was both because I thought I would like to get a reaction to things, but also because I thought it would demonstrate that I was doing a serious job. And
also kind of buttered her up.
It might have buttered up a little. That could have been a secondary consideration. And so I hired a reporter in Pittsburgh to go to the University of Pittsburgh for me as a researcher to go through Jack Murtha's papers. He had donated his papers to the University of Pittsburgh. I'm sure I don't think anyone had ever gone through them. We found that with a lot of archival papers, that no one had ever bothered to look at them. And there were these handwritten notes on a Big Chief tablet about what he thought about Nancy Pelosi, because he thought he would write a memoir, which he never did. He passed away before he did that, could have done that. And so the researcher took copies of it, scanned it, and sent it to me, and I made copies of that and gave it to her. And so here are these notes that say, and I don't think Murtha was the most emotionally available kind of guy, I'm guessing, but this was like what he really thought about Nancy Pelosi in very personal terms, about how much he respected her, and about how they had one disagreement, and she turned out to be right, and I turned out to be wrong. And she really, it was one of the few times she kind of teared up. I mean, she was very affected by seeing these notes from Jack Murtha, and asked me if she could keep a copy, which of course I brought them so she could keep them. That was, I think, doing that, and there was a couple other things that I brought to her that she was unaware of from her own life, and that took a long way toward building some trust.
Oh, I'm sure it did. Well, getting to this matter of respect, whether you like her or don't like her, I think she's incredibly well respected, and she's respected by a lot of her foes too. I mean, she was one of the only people that Donald Trump didn't call a nickname, for very long. But also, you talk about Newt Gingrich and what he thought about Nancy Pelosi. I thought that was pretty interesting.
So, Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi are not friends. That can't surprise anybody. They, in fact, are implacable foes. They disagree on every piece of policy you can imagine. She thought she was terribly dismayed when Republicans won control of the House in 1994 and made him Speaker. But I interviewed Gingrich about his experiences with Pelosi, which he described as all bad, that her policies were bad, and she was a super liberal, and she followed all these bad policies. But he said he really respected her as a politician. And he said that sometimes you look across an ocean and you see somebody and you say, there's a fellow pirate. And when I look at, Newt Gingrich said, when I look at Nancy Pelosi, I say, there's a fellow pirate, which for Newt Gingrich is really high praise.
This must be incredibly high praise, right? So why do you think that Donald Trump never really, I mean, he called her Nervous Nancy a couple of times, but not like he called other people things very often.
I think he was a little intimidated by her. He's not alone in having that feeling in dealing with Nancy Pelosi. And I think he also was convinced that he thought they were fellow deal makers. They had known each other only slightly before his election. She had done some fundraising. He had made a contribution to Democratic congressional campaigns. But he thought he clearly had some respect for her. And I did an interview with Trump in the fall of 2018, not for the book, but for USA Today, in which I asked him if he was worried about Democrats winning control of the House in a few weeks, which indeed they did in the 2018 midterms. And he said, amazingly, he was quite sanguine about the prospect. He said he didn't think it'd be disastrous. He was counting on Pelosi to keep the House from impeaching him, which she had done up to that point. And he thought that they could, he said it might be easier to make a deal with the Democrats than with the Republicans on an issue like a big infrastructure bill, something we're still waiting to have passed, once again being negotiated these days. And now, of course, he turned out to be wrong. The election of a Democratic House in 2018 was catastrophic for him. It led to him being impeached not once but twice. They never got an infrastructure bill. But that was his view of Pelosi, even though she had been the congressional figure who had stood up to him the most. In fact, there were ways in which she was the politician. She was the face of the Democratic opposition to Donald Trump, which is remarkable, which is remarkable. The most disruptive president in our history, and Nancy Pelosi is the figure who most often stands up to him.
Well, and the optics of all of that. I mean, you mentioned that meeting in the White House after the 2018 election, when I think 40-some Democrats came into the House, an amazing victory, and he kind of challenges her power. And what did she say? She said, Mr. President,
don't question the authority that I bring to this meeting.
Don't question the strength I bring to this meeting. And so she was all about it.
Yeah, and that was the meeting where she comes out, speaking of the power of clothing, she comes out onto the White House driveway afterwards in that swingy red coat, which can't we all just see it in our mind's eye? She told me that she hadn't meant to send a big message with that coat, she wore it because it was a cold day and the coat had just come back from the dry cleaner. So she puts on this coat, she goes to this White House meeting. It is very confrontational with the president. She walks out in those sunglasses and that swingy red coat looking like a warrior. And she said that it's annoying because now she can't wear the coat because it's become such a symbol. People think she's trying to send a message when she wears it.
Well, that's funny. I mean, look, she's had a lot of very public battles with him. I think none quite so shocking publicly as when she stood behind him when he's giving the State of the Union in her white suit and she rips up his speech. Now, I was actually shocked by that. That seemed a very non-Nancy Pelosi thing to do. What did you think?
Also, have you ever seen, never in my life have I seen a political action like that from the leader of one branch of government to another. It was jaw-dropping. And I think it was the only time Trump got under her skin in public that I think that she lost her temper. Which is something she almost never does. Now, she denies that she lost her temper, by the way. I interviewed her about that, about what happened. She said that, so she's sitting up there next to Pence. President Trump comes in, hands her a text of the State of the Union. This is the State of the Union speech in 2020. He hands her the text, which in a leather binder, which is the tradition, at a State of the Union address. She starts to scan through it to see what he's going to say. And she sees something that she thinks is inaccurate. And she wants to put a check mark there so she can come back to dispute whatever this statement is. And she doesn't have a pen because apparently you do not carry your purse with you up to the dais when you're the Speaker of the House.
She's not the Queen of England.
She's not the Queen of England. So she's sitting at if you remember the scene, she's sitting at a big, very substantial looking desk. So she opens the little drawer there and the drawer is empty. There's no pen. So what to do? She said she made just a tiny, tiny little tear in the margin of the paper at the point where there's this statement that she thinks is untrue. And then she keeps reading and she sees a second thing she thinks is untrue. So she makes another little tear. And she keeps reading and guess what? She finds a third thing she thinks is wrong. Anyway, by the time she has finished looking through this speech, there are tears up and down the text of the State of the Union address. And so at that point, she said she still hadn't decided what to do about it. Then Trump announces that he is presenting the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh, who is seated with the First Lady, with Melania Trump in the First Lady's box. And this really steams her because, for one thing, Rush Limbaugh, very divisive figure, reviled by Democrats. For another thing, she didn't feel this was the proper forum for a president to take that action. It was her chamber. It was Congress. This was not the place for the president to deliver this award if he wanted to deliver it. And so that also angers her. And so she decided, she said the speech ends, and she decides if he's going to shred the truth, as evidenced by all these little tears in the margin of the text, I'm going to shred his speech. And she stands up, and the text is too thick to tear in half. So she divides it into 4 sections and tears each one of them, tosses them down on the desk in an extraordinary show of disrespect. Trump is totally unaware. His back is to her. He's basking in applause from the Republican side of the chamber. And Mike Pence is standing right next to her, pretending not to notice.
It was incredibly shocking. I mean, it was almost as shocking, I thought, as what her daughter Alexandra said about her once. You know, how she was going to approach meetings with the president. And her daughter said of Nancy Pelosi, she'll cut your head off and you won't even know you're bleeding. That's all you need to know about her. No one ever won betting against Nancy Pelosi.
You know, she's pretty fierce. She really, I got the Pelosi treatment just once.
I was about to ask you. All right, so what happened?
In the 9th interview I did, I was asking her about an episode that she thought shouldn't be in the book, and I thought should be in the book. And so she says, why are you asking about that? And I said, well, here's why I think this is important. And she says, it's not important for this reason, it's not appropriate to include for this reason. And we are clearly at loggerheads. And she then somehow becomes bigger. Like she's 5'5", but as she's pressuring me to explain and defend myself, she gets to be like at 6'2" by the end of this conversation. And she doesn't, she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't threaten me. She just kept asking me more specific and probing questions that forced me to articulate why I had the view I did. And by the end of this, I had not relented, and the episode is in the book. And she had not relented. She still thought the episode shouldn't be in the book. And I left, but I was incredibly shaken. I mean,
like, were you sweating?
Like I was like, because, I felt the Pelosi treatment. So it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I parked on Capitol Hill. So I go to my car, I drive straight home. I pour a glass of wine. I crawl into bed. And I watched Rizzoli and Isles reruns for about 3 hours until I felt calmer.
Now, are you going to reveal to us which episode in the book this is, or
no? But I'll tell you, it did make me, and I debated whether to include it in the book because, but it made me, gave me a greater understanding of how she does her business with. Can you imagine being a junior Democrat in Congress and the speaker calls you in and convinces you to vote for the Affordable Care Act? I mean, I think it explains a lot about her effectiveness in situations like that.
It absolutely would. So, what surprised you about your time with Nancy Pelosi?
Well, she does. I think she's kind of shy. I think I think she's not. I think she doesn't live for the spotlight. And in fact, she's not that great in the spotlight. She's great in the closed-door room. And that's different from most of the politicians I've interviewed.
Well, she's not eloquent, right? But she is persistent.
She is strong and smart and not very well-spoken in big occasions. She can't give a big inspirational speech like Barack Obama. She's not great at impromptu Q&A with reporters. She gets herself into trouble. She says things like, we have to pass the Affordable Care Act before we can figure out what's in it. That's not exactly what she meant, but it became a huge Republican talking point. One guy in San Francisco, a former Democratic operative in San Francisco, told me that she's terrible at the things you can see, and she's great at the things you can't see. So she's terrible at giving the big speech. She's terrific at negotiating the private deal.
That is great. Do we have some questions from the audience, I think? A few out there? Okay.
I think we should make Tom Danny ask a question because he was one of the first politicians I ever covered when I was a local reporter for Newsday. I was the top reporter in Islip, Long Island. I'm not bragging. There were two of us on the Islip team. I was the team leader. He was running for his first bid for re-election. That was the race I covered, I think. And I interviewed him for the book, and he was very helpful, and he knows Nancy Pelosi very well. So instead of a question, why don't you tell us something we don't know about Nancy Pelosi?
Well, first of all, I've read the book. My daughter worked for the speaker.
Oh.
You have to.
Accustomed as I am to public.
Well, you came dressed for it as well, yeah.
So the book is magnificent, and it captures Nancy in a way that is truly unique. And everything, she speaks with I call it a breathless hesitancy. And sometimes it's very off-putting. But, I didn't serve with her when she became speaker, though I had a lobbying firm, and I worked very hard for her to become both the leader that she replaced Dave Bonnier, and the only thing I can say about her, and is it in the book? We had dinner every Tuesday night at my house. Chuck, Nancy, George Miller, Marty Russo, and Barbara Boxer and Barbara Kennelly came. And the five men were talking about childbirth. And Nancy and Barbara, who between them had 9 children, said, I'm sure you guys know a lot about this, but you might want to hear from one of us who actually delivered children. And she had the ability, first of all, she's very Italian, very loyal, and she makes very few political mistakes. And she is, in my opinion, not only the most important female politician, I would say she's the best speaker the House of Representatives has ever seen. And the one thing that my wife Carol, who is in the back, who was both the EPA administrator and the energy and climate czar under President Obama, on the night that the House passed the Affordable Care Act, we went and watched in the gallery. And as Susan mentioned, the idea that you had 5 children and you had to herd them together to get to do things, if you watched Nancy on the floor that night, all she did was go around and listen and gently cajole people to pass a piece of legislation that is one of the most important that Congress has ever done. And it speaks to her incredible ability to be a great listener, to be a great leader. She is a remarkable woman, and this book pays the appropriate due to that person.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
So I've got some questions here that really come right off of that, which is about her legacy, right? She is clearly, currently, I would say, the most powerful, woman in America, one of the most powerful women in the world. She has held these roles repeatedly. But what is her legacy going to be as a legislator, as a leader?
This kind of goes to Tom's point, which is, I think if you talk to people about who is Nancy Pelosi, they'll say, first woman Speaker of the House. And that is true. But if you look at her legacy, I think you can make the case that she is the most consequential Speaker of the House since the legendary Sam Rayburn, Tom says maybe even in history. That's also something that John Boehner, the former Republican Speaker of the House, told me described Pelosi as the most powerful speaker in his lifetime and maybe ever. And it's almost as though the fact that she's the first woman obscures her other legacy, which is not related to her gender. Think about the big events of the first 2 decades of the 21st century. She was the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee at the 9/11 attacks. She was the highest ranking member of Congress to oppose the Iraq War from its beginning. She was singularly responsible for passage of that unpopular bank bailout in 2008 that cost Democrats politically. She was planning to step down after the 2016 election when President Hillary Clinton took over. At that point, she stays in Washington at the age of 76 and becomes the face of the Democratic resistance to Donald Trump. That is a considerable legacy.
Well, and that does get to one of these questions here. Do you think that the specter of Trump is what made her strength shine at this moment of history? But that leads me to sort of part 2 of that question is, now that he's not there, well, he's kind of not there, is she going to retire? She's 81 years old.
I think that this is likely her last term in Congress and as Speaker. The problem with sounding too confident about that is that she hasn't said that in the kind of clear way that you could that makes it totally clear, completely commits her to not running again. But in 2018, and people forget this, she had a reasonably serious challenge to her speakership. There were a fair number of House members, even some who liked her and respected her, thought it was time for a new generation of leadership. And she offered a deal to them that if they reelected her in 2018, she would serve no more than 2 terms. Now, interestingly, when I did the book and looked at it, it turns out that was never put in the Democratic rules. So there's no rule that says she has to do that. There's no law that says she can't run again. You can't arrest her if she does. I'm not even sure you could defeat her if she does. But she indicated early this year that she remembered this offer that she made, and she signaled that she plans to stand by it. So it's my expectation that this is her last term, and then something will be different. Democrats may well, or more than likely to lose control of the House in the midterms next year, although that's not written in stone. There'll be a new generation of leadership taking over. They'll have different strengths and weaknesses than Nancy Pelosi have. They'll have a different political landscape than she has faced. So things will be different. This is one reason I wanted to do this book now, because it seemed like the right moment to take a look at Pelosi.
Because, I mean, she is getting challenged all over the place, right? I mean, John Boehner had the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus, and she's got the Squad and other young, up-and-coming progressives who are pushing really hard. Do you think she can hold things together?
And she's got the narrowest of margins,
Right.
the narrowest margin of a House majority in modern times. So I think she has done a pretty remarkable job so far in holding them together on that big COVID relief bill. There was a really nasty fight Thursday in the House where it looked like the Squad was going to bring down a Democratic proposal for security funding for the Capitol. And if I were still doing the book, I would be looking hard at how she managed to turn that around. She got 3 of the most liberal members of the House to vote present rather than to vote no. And that's the only reason that bill passed by a single vote. I would love to, I hope to one day know the inside story of what happened with that. But it's a sign of the fractures in the Democratic Party. If you've got a majority, it means you've got people who are in different places from different kinds of districts. She's been very sensitive to that, but it's enormously hard to hold it all together.
And she kind of makes fun of these younger women in some ways, and you write about it in the book. They're up there with these purity tests, and she's all about getting, operational, getting something done, right? And you have to compromise.
She told me that when she looks at AOC, at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she sees a little of herself when she was younger, maybe when she was protesting, and when she couldn't understand why politicians were cutting deals that only left you with half a loaf. But that's not her perspective now. And the interviews I did with her were scheduled well in advance, but several of them happened to fall on really historic days. So one interview I had with her happened to be the afternoon that things with the Squad really blew up over an immigration vote. And this was an interview in which she was as candid as she had ever been with me, where first she insisted there was nothing to see here, these are just Democrats being Democrats. And then I used a phrase that she had used. I said, do the members of the Squad recognize the difference between making a fine pate and making sausage? Because one thing Pelosi has said is, it would be great to be making a fine pate, but most of the time we're making sausage, meaning it's messy and it's coarse and you have blood on the floor at the end of it. And she said they do not understand that difference. And she, quoting Dave Obey, a former appropriations chairman, he was famous for this saying. She said, some people come to Washington to pose for holy pictures and say, see how pure I am. And other people come to Washington to get something done. And when they want to get something done, they'll realize what you need to do. And I can tell you that if it's praise when Newt Gingrich says you're a fellow pirate, it is not praise when Nancy Pelosi says you came here to pose for holy pictures.
Definitely not. All right, and we just have a couple more minutes, but I want to get in just a few more of these questions. All right, so here's an interesting one. All right, did Nancy Pelosi eat a Dove bar when she asked if you wanted one, or was she just seeing how you would handle being offered something difficult to eat? Was it a test for you?
It may have been a test for me, but she did eat a Dove bar herself. And by the way, no chocolate fell off. It was perfect, yes.
Right,
Maybe mine was a trick Dove bar, like a trick birthday candle.
Right. A question also, going back on Nancy Pelosi here. Did Nancy Pelosi give any credit to Trinity College for forming any of her, commitments to social justice or having a career?
Absolutely. That's such a great question, both to Trinity College, now Trinity University, and also to the Institute of Notre Dame, which is the all-girls Catholic school in Baltimore that she went in. She attended from kindergarten through the 12th grade. Both institutions for girls taught by nuns, with a tradition of social justice. You know, interestingly, 4 years ahead of her at the Institute of Notre Dame in Baltimore was a young woman named Barbara Mikulski, who became the longest-serving woman in the history of Congress. So there might be something to say about all girls' education there as well.
Well, and there were some other, Kathleen Sebelius went there, and I think Kellyanne Conway went there. A very interesting range.
To Trinity College,
To Trinity College, yeah. So, in your view, does Nancy Pelosi have a philosophy, a guiding philosophy or governance? And if so, what is that?
If you ask her why is she in politics, she always gives the same answer, which is it's all about the children. She says the motivating impulse is that 1 in 5 children in the United States live in poverty.
This is interesting. The question is, has she trained others to take her place? I guess that's one way to ask it. Another way to ask it is, in terms of succession planning, like you want to do in a business, who do you think she would point to?
So I think the person who is the obvious successor is Hakeem Jeffries, the congressman from New York. He's been in the leadership. He would also be a groundbreaker if he became leader of House Democrats. He would be the first person of color to lead a major party in either chamber of Congress. They're close. She put him on the team of impeachment managers in Trump's first impeachment. Those impeachment managers, that was a real sign of who she had respect for. It propelled Val Demings to now seek statewide office in the Senate, challenging Marco Rubio. I think that's a sign that if she has a candidate, it's likely to be Hakeem Jeffries. But, I think if you ask Pelosi about this upcoming race, she would say, nobody's going to give you power, you have to seize it. And that Hakeem Jeffries or anyone else is going to have to wage a campaign and win that job. It is not possible for her to deliver it to them.
Well, I think we are just about out of time. I just want to ask you one more question,
Yes.
but it's about you, actually, and not about Nancy Pelosi. So my friend Susan Page has gotten Barbara Bush to do repeated interviews with her. Barbara Bush, I believe, even turned over her diaries to you after initially, I think, not even agreeing to talk at all, and then you somehow got that. Nancy Pelosi, it starts out with one interview, it ends up 10, and now you've got this great book. What is it, do you think, about you that lets people open up, or what are those skills, or maybe we can all learn a little bit about being a good interviewer?
Well, of course, you're a very good interviewer yourself. I think it's the same thing that makes Pelosi skilled as a politician, which is the ability to listen. And whenever I of course, taped every interview I did and transcribed all of them, and what I keep noticing is, why don't I shut up when I'm transcribing them? So one of the lessons I've tried to learn is to shut up and just let people talk.
Well, and with that, I think we will end. Susan, thank you very much.
Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you again, and I strongly recommend the book, and welcome you to come to our next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.